Hello, welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm your host, Drew, joined by my friend and also the host, Alex, here. We're going to be talking today about eminent domain and what that means in a political sense, why it's one of the most controversial rights that a government has, and the defenders of eminent domain and the opponents. And let's start getting to some examples as well. To start out, I want to define eminent domain, and what that is the government's right to take private property for public use with just compensation. And what that means is taking of a property is literal the seizure of the land or the things on the land, and removing all the economic benefit from a person and going to the government. So this is not just zoning laws that say you can't have a fence 30 feet by water. That would not be eminent domain. Eminent domain would be you can't have any property by this waterfront, and the government will seize your land that you have there currently. But they can only do that for public use, and public use there's been a lot of litigation over what that means. It can sometimes include economic development can be considered public use. So in the Supreme Court, there's a court case of Kelo versus the City of New London, which is in the United States, not in England, but Kelo versus the City of New London. They determined that the government seizing private property there and then giving over that land for private companies to make a commercial district was under the guise of economic development for eminent domain. But then some people have argued against that, and the federal government went on to clarify. But the idea is you're taking something for public use. A great example is the interstate freeways, right? A freeway is not owned by a private company, it's for public use. And then it has to be with just compensation, which is the fair market value of the property taken. And at first, it did not include removal and relocation costs. However, some states and the federal government have added caveats to relocation assistance for that as well, but it varies. And so, like I mentioned before, popular examples of this are eminent domain was used to get land to finish the interstate highway system in the United States. They figured it was worth removing the private property of some individuals for the public use of freeways for the infrastructure of the greater good. And there's philosophical arguments for and against. So let's get into some of that. Alex, what do you think of eminent domain, and what are some of the philosophical arguments that rattle around your head when you think of this topic?
Yeah, great question, man, and great summary of what it is. First off, I just want to bring up the Constitution for a second because I think that'll be important to mention later. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, says that Congress nor any government agency shall take private property for public use without just compensation. This is kind of a recognition, of pre-existing power to take private property for public use, blah, blah, blah. And in the early years, the Fifth Amendment kind of pertained to D.C., and so in broader sense, the federal government. But it was that Cole versus United States case in 1876, which actually kind of used language from the 14th Amendment, which said the power of eminent domain of state governments was unrestrained by any federal authority. So to summarize is that this was something that was in the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment saying you can't just take someone's land without paying for them. And a lot of people thought that was more just federal government, and states actually at times have tried to use that as well, using the 14th Amendment as the language for it. And just also I would just add before I go into how I feel about it is that I feel like there's it's a tale of two eminent domain cases here. Is that I feel like in the early days it was mainly just for what they called, condemning dangerous places to help the public good, right? Old beat down public buildings they would demolish and provide cities with drinking water. There's an example in New York of putting in aqueducts in old buildings, demolishing these old private buildings and putting in aqueducts for the health of the city. It was mainly just looking at public parks, public water, and transportation, and this was kind of just condemnation, or like, and so that was kind of the beginning. But then it went into land acquisition in the 20th century, and that's where it kind of gets a little more blurry, because there's good examples of it. Like, there's one, the Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida, where they saved a bunch of land that could have been used for private use and could have eroded the environmental beauty of that region. But instead, or the Redwood National Forest in California is another one. They used eminent domain to secure that and preserve that. But then that also gets into, so many other topics. Like, I would just say off the bat that generally I understand it. I understand that, especially as a growing country, sometimes you need to expand public programs, transportation, parks, public safety, things like fresh water. And sometimes that does mean you're going to interfere with a private business, a private property, a private piece of land. And sometimes there needs to be a way to deal with that. And I understand that sometimes for the national good, private goods need to be thrown out the door. That being said, I find that the problem is compensation. And you kind of mentioned it a little bit there, is that it doesn't always make up for some of the, like, outside costs. And also my worry is that, like, the highway interstate ones, I think a really good way to start with this is that in the 50s, like, I love Eisenhower. I think he's one of the best Republicans in a long time, and the interstate system in a lot of ways was necessary. A very big country like ours needs an interstate system. That being said, the problem is that they used eminent domain to go through a lot of these city centers. And the problem is that, like, I've been to Europe a lot. I spent a lot of time in Europe. There's beautiful city centers there, just that go back 500-600 years. They're just so pretty. And there were city centers in a lot of the Midwest and the South in the United States that were gorgeous. Not as old as in Europe, but a lot of them were demolished to make way for these freeways. And the thing is okay, so if you compensate based on the money value, yeah, okay, I guess on paper that makes sense. But the problem is, what about the history? What about the culture? What about the fact that people have to move out of there? What about the cost of building something new? And if you just pay someone and compensate them at the time, it doesn't, it doesn't look into inflation, for example. And so there's a lot of issues that I have about where is the line between preserving historical monuments, historical buildings, and just culture, and also putting a nation forward with progress. And that's my issue, is that I feel like eminent domain, sometimes people aren't compensated justly, and sometimes it just creates land grabs that maybe are questionable.
Yeah, this is one of those issues where you have a lot. It is not very clear cut partisan, right?
Right.
I've heard people on the left argue against eminent domain, exactly what you're talking about in the highway things, because they argue that it was determined to go through city centers, which were predominantly more minorities, and that the government used eminent domain and purposely avoided using eminent domain in white neighborhoods, and would enact eminent domain in more poverty-stricken black neighborhoods, so that it was, even though on paper this is a government right to use, they see it as, well, this is basically systemic racism being enacted through government choosing who to bulldoze. Um, a good example of where there's a lot of controversy, for where I'm from in Los Angeles, is the Chavez Ravine, which is a Latino town, a small town of predominantly Mexicans, that used to be where Dodger Stadium currently is. And the why it's also particularly controversial is that the original use for eminent domain against that town, which was only, I think, a few hundred families, not a huge town, but a small one just outside of LA, and they said that they were bulldozing their land to make way for public housing projects, and that they would be compensated not only for their land, but be offered a like a spot in the new public housing projects. Well, the Chavez Ravine public housing projects were canceled shortly after people were evicted. There was even a famous photos, I think, from 1952, when they did the final evictions of the last 20 families who were refused to go, were not taking any compensation, and they were dragged out of their homes by police officers in Los Angeles, and it sparked a lot of controversy. Well, the public use for these housing projects didn't even get completed, and then the land was then sold to a private developer to be used for Dodger Stadium. And so in that case, they weren't even promised what they were promised, which was, well, we're going to use this for a certain certain housing project, and you'll get a spot in that. No one got that. And so again, your example of, there are oftentimes that idea of just compensation is not there. Uh, um, could create a lot of controversy. And so, while yes, we all enjoy the Dodgers here in like LA. In fact, LA is a very baseball town. The Dodgers are like part of the city's culture. Dodger Stadium is like considered one of the things you got to do if you're in LA for more than a week. Is just go to a Dodger game, get a Dodger dog. And so is a lot of added value from Dodger Stadium. Absolutely, thousands of jobs over the years, thousands. So that balance is hard to it's hard to look at that balance, but it's certainly, I know that example, the Chavez Ravine example for Dodger Stadium, is used on the left as an example of against eminent domain. I also know that there's plenty of right wing, especially more libertarian types, that are against the notion of eminent domain in general. Even for public use with just compensation, they still think that the government has no right to take, and that's where that's why this is one of the most heavily litigated ideas and issues around the government, is because it goes against the American idea of home ownership and private property. But at the same time, it has allowed us to, and is almost required for the public infrastructure that has given us the advanced society we live in. The highway systems and stadiums are massive increases on our economic activity that we all see a benefit from. And so, it's a tough one, but I do think eminent domain has to exist, and especially as we go looking forward towards issues of climate change and private property usage that has outside effects like pollution and things. I think eminent domain is going to come into play more so with climate regulation. Oh, hold on. You are muted.
Oh, sorry. I do that sometimes in case I sneeze.
No worries.
My allergies are still bad up here with all that pine pollen. But anyways, yeah, like you brought up some really interesting points there. First off, yeah, like I was just reading through abuses of eminent domain on the Justice Department's website, and there are a lot. And I think that's the problem is like how prickly the U.S. system is with like kind of conjoining private with public. And so a lot of times, like, even though it's for public use, sometimes you're going to have private contractors and developers in the process, right. And then you get personal reasons. And that to me sounds like what happened at Dodger Stadium. Also, like, side note, you're going to hate me because I actually, we went to Chapman down there for 4 years. I never went to Dodger Stadium. So, yeah, that's a problem. I kind of feel guilty when you mentioned that. But anyways, I just want to turn this kind of to more of a hypothetical for a second, just because it's the main reason why I guess you could put me more as a cultural libertarian on this issue. And it's basically, there's a guy named Hernando de Soto, who is a Peruvian economist who won, I believe it was the Pulitzer Prize and a Nobel Prize in his book, The Mystery of Capital, which came out in 2000. And it's one of my favorite books I've read recently. And it talks about how in the U.S. there is contract law. There is ownership, so people know whose property is whose. But his argument is that capitalism hasn't worked in a lot of the developing world because there just isn't written contracts. He's definitely pro-capitalism, but he believes that business law and business rights just don't exist because of the informal economy in a lot of the world. And so my issue is that we've seen abuses of eminent domain involving property rights throughout the world. Not eminent domain specifically, because I think that's more of a U.S. term and more of a UK, Old English term for that. But there is an interesting example that I always just kind of point to is in South Africa and Zimbabwe specifically. There was that, obviously, apartheid rule in South Africa specifically, and in Zimbabwe, there was a lot of white land ownership. And after the fall of apartheid and more ethnic and local groups started running a lot of South Africa, there was kind of this idea of reparations through grasping large amounts of land from white owners.
Right.
And it really created kind of a bitter rivalry between poor white people and poor African tribes that had been there their whole lives. And it's like, yeah, a lot of these people were Afrikaners, they had descendants from either the Netherlands or from South Africa, but these were also poor people who might not have been directly involved in this. And Robert Mugabe, who was the ex-leader of Zimbabwe, he was known for sending mobs and squads out to seize land from white people. And of course, this actually is what Fox News has used as white replacement theory a lot of the time. They always use this as an example, so I don't really want to go too far down the weeds with that. But that is a conversation to be had, is when land is seized for political reasons or for trying to, commit to solving past atrocities. And but then again, just while I'm on that point, I will say that in the United States, because we have such a good, I mean, not good, but it's better than a lot of the world in terms of property ownership and legal codes behind it. There is the Hawaii Land Reform Act of 1967, which actually is a good example of land grabs. And this is basically like 72 private landowners possessed pretty much 50% of the land on the Big Island, I believe it was. I don't actually have that, but I think it was the Big Island. And basically, they wanted to take some of this land away from 50% from this like 70 people who owned 50% of the land, because indigenous and local people had nothing. And the Supreme Court actually agreed that this was constitutional because it wasn't for public use, but it was better for the public good. And I think like the US can have those complicated conversations about what is better for the public good. The Supreme Court actually seemed to kind of come down favorably on some of these cases, but I just worry like the general idea of partisan land grabbing, especially in a very divided country.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting historical examples of eminent domain, not just in the U.S. as well. There's also the 1880s had the Irish Land War, which was the same
Mm.
thing, which was in Northern Ireland. They found that way too much, well, or the government. I mean, actually, the British government in Northern Ireland had said, okay, there's actually a problem. The way too much of the land is owned by Protestant Northern Irish, like Protestants that have British origins, and the Catholic Irish in Northern Ireland had very little in land ownership, and they were revolting and fighting. And there's also, this is post potato famine as well, so this is 1880s. It was not looking good for anybody, and so because of the fighting, it eventually it even got to the point where people were like, there was land grabs at first by the Protestants for the Catholics, and the Catholics were literally fighting off soldiers with their pickets, and then they reversed it and were giving back land. But there was plenty of examples of the government seizing and moving land from different private hands in Ireland to try and quell rebellions and to try and recalculate the land ownership percentage in Northern Ireland. Um, so yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it's like any other, like there's plenty of instances in government where we have to allow some things that make us a little uncomfortable with governments. Like, we all accept we are giving the government a monopoly on the use of force. We are giving the government, in most cases, right, as a general sense, we're letting the government have the ability to kill, right? For any state that has a death penalty, that's a thing. Um, so and it's not like I would want someone else to have that power. So there are things that I think are in that realm of, we have to allow governments to have some kind of powers that maybe make us feel uncomfortable, but are required for an order in society. So the monopoly on force is one, right? Police forces, law enforcement has to have more of a say in enforcing laws than random gangs or vigilantes. And in this one is, and when push comes to shove, I think the government does have a right in some instances, but that is why I think we need to have a robust regulated system that can, I guess, protect the individuals from when eminent domain does go too far. But like I said earlier, I think the issues of, as the issues over freeways become less of a thing. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's more and more. I don't know. In my city, they're constantly building freeways, and there seems to be not
Mm-hmm.
enough. But I see things like, you know, like beachfront property. Like, that's a limited resource, and eventually, with the population increases, at some point there will actually be not enough beachfront property. Now, maybe Alaska, there'd be so much in Alaska that's like not worth it. But like beachfront property in California, if everyone had a private property on the beach and there was none of it was there for public use, at some point I would be like, no, you should use eminent domain. I think people have a right to go to the beach in California. Eminent domain should be there that the government should seize at least some part of the beach back that people get there. Now there is restrictions on beachfront properties because of that reason. So there is absolutely a use for eminent domain in modern society. But yes, I agree with you though, Alex, that we have to be very, very careful of when and how it's used.
No, absolutely, and I think we can definitely agree on that. And then an interesting example. I was talking to one of my coworkers today, and we were kind of talking about homelessness. And
Mm,
that was one that kind of triggered my mind, especially in California. And I'm not really
yes.
trying to put out any solutions with this one, but it is an interesting one because, we were talking about the highways. I think it was the 1956 Highway Act that Eisenhower put out. And, that looked, well, fun fact, it was like a lot of GM tech and executives were involved in this plan because they wanted cars more used. Really surprising in the U.S. that, private industries would be influencing this. But basically, they use the term blight a lot, right? Which, and especially in the 50s, given kind of the racially driven time, a lot of the blight meant inner cities, like you said.
Yes.
But now blight could also mean the fact that there's a serious homeless problem in a lot of the West Coast, and I could understand that if you're, a working person with an apartment or a house and a job, it's ruining your quality of life to have that amount of homelessness so close to where you live. Especially if you're, a homeowner or a landowner, like it's going to ruin your property values. And like that would be an interesting one is like using that term blight again to talk about the homeless problem in this, like specifically California, Seattle, and Portland, where I think is kind of the main places. Just the weather's better in California, so people are there. But like that's a thing I always wonder is like they use the term urban renewal to unfortunately destroy these inner cities, during the highway days. But like I wonder, like Drew, do you think that eminent domain would like say they basically had portions of like what's that park in LA where there's big homeless camps? I
Well,
always forget.
this
Echo?
is, I mean, this just happened. This is exactly what just happened. So Echo Park. So Echo Park was
Huh.
basically, like you say, I mean, you could say, but it's the legal term of blighted. There was shanty towns all over the park. Reports of violence at night, right? Like assaults, people finding needles, right? Like, but like really bad. And Echo Park is supposed to be like the golden jewel of parks in LA. It's it has a big pond. There's fountains. You can see downtown. You're up kind of on this hill. It's a huge park. And that was one of the things that just happened recently was there was protests on both sides, like for and against the action, where the city decided that because for a while they didn't do anything about these massive shanty towns. And I'm talking like tents, like hundreds and hundreds of tents. And they did eventually decide that okay, this has to go, and so they evacuated. I mean, they literally forcibly removed thousands of homeless people from Echo Park, and basically with that idea of that this is blighted, and that's the and as and I when I first heard that term, I cringed a little bit because I do feel like, oh man, like I mean, we are talking about people's livelihoods, we're talking about people's a homeless person, their entire possessions was maybe in that tent in that park. However, the other side of that coin is very valid, which is this is a park. This allotment is there for the entire public of Los Angeles to enjoy as
Mm-hmm.
a public park to like bring kids and run around and bring my dog and fish and whatever. And it's not being used for that purpose now. It's now being used by a private individual to do heroin in the bathroom and to or a private individual that's not doing heroin but still is impoverished and has to use facilities and put up their tent on a walkway, right? That could be blocking disabled people. Like there's a countless other things that are happening on this park that are not for the original intended use, and that not only are not for the intended use, but prevent the overall public from the original use. I can't walk my dog safely if I feel I'm going to get assaulted at the park or step on a needle that can infect me, right? Or I have to go around a tent city. So that conversation was had in Los Angeles, and eventually, a push came to shove, the police cleared it. And frankly, this might offend some of my more liberal friends, but I agree with the action. I personally feel that that park should be used for park purposes. And so, while the homeless problem is a huge problem, we need to have more housing. The solution is to not let people build a slum in Echo Park.
And I mean, I would just add to that. I think that's a really good point, and I full heartedly agree with that. Is that um, like this sounds a little bit cold, but I feel like the idea of a public good or the public use or the public betterment involves like helping the general community who are paying into the system. And to be completely honest, like a lot of these parks specifically that have kind of been overrun just with homeless and looters, or not looters and squatters, excuse me, is that there's a compensation question there. Is like this is obviously a public park already. So is their personal property what is then considered the compensation? Like that does confuse me a little bit, you know.
Sure.
Um, but the thing is, this reminds me of the early days when they used eminent domain under the wording of the original Fifth Amendment, which was kind of like to facilitate public health and public use. And like if parks are getting dirty and dangerous and no one wants to go there, then I think that's part of the public good to make them safer. Again, I don't know how you compensate people that are just living there or squatting there without paying to be there. Now that's a whole other conversation. But I think that like right now the homeless problems in especially the West Coast are an interesting example of like a more convoluted issue with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, while it might, like you said, it's like already on a public park, so it might not be the same like constitutional arguments around eminent domain as like on a federal case. I still think it's still the idea of government forcibly removing people for the greater
Mm-hmm.
good, right? Or forcibly doing something against a private individual for the greater good, and
Mm,
and while it is a case by case basis and there are lines that can't be crossed, generally think that this power of the government has to be maintained and will I think will only have to be used more in the future, as populations increase and as the nuances of land use, because land use isn't just do I get to fish on the creek or not. Now it really is there oil below? What are the implications? Well, if you do something with your cows at this part of the creek, it affects people 100 miles down the creek. So land use, like I've advocated for the readjusting our understanding of land use and land ownership in general anyway, just on a grand scale. But to include part of that, I think has to be the the understanding that eminent domain is a power that the government will and has to use, but with that in mind, we make sure that it's not used unjustly. And I think we're both in agreement that I think we could probably do more to define just compensation more. I think that especially at the state level, that difference between the states and federal level, I think some states or don't do anything for like reallocation assistance, and so should definitely do more.
absolutely. And just last thing I'll add, I know we're going over on this one, but it's like I feel like it or not, this is probably not gonna be a popular thing to say, but it's like California has a surplus right now, and it's mainly because of capital gains taxes on a lot of wealthy people. Like California does really well with tax revenue because of wealthy people, and if we're seeing more Californians leave than come over the last year, and I just heard it. This is all anecdotal, but there's a lot of like public figures and that have made it very vocal that they're leaving because of the homeless problem. Like over time, those taxes that they are paying into California trickle down into the entire economy. That's why a lot of us got $600 checks a few months ago from the government of California, specifically not the federal government, but because of Gavin Newsom's own surplus, and they were sending out checks. And the thing is if more rich people that are actually like funding a lot of these taxes, if they're leaving because they don't feel like it's a good place to live anymore, it does trickle down to everyone else.
If that's true, that would be a worry. I'm not as worried about a California exodus as you, but that's maybe a different topic for another day.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, certainly if that's true, that's theoretically would be concerning. But so, what are your thoughts on eminent domain? Let us know. Certainly an uncomfortable topic, especially if you've been the victim of it, as some people in Texas for the wall were. And yeah, let us know your thoughts on eminent domain and the rights the government has to seize public or private property.